Howdy, partners. This is likely to be the rip-roaringest rodeo of a lecture you've ever heard. Yee-haw! Now, this actually isn't a costume. I do own a cowboy hat. I lived in Texas for several years, and it was kind of a requirement. But anyway, today we're going to be talking about invasive species, non-native species, and we'd like to start this lecture with a quiz. The quiz is about this particular photo in the initial slide here, with the lizard on a tree, and the question is, where was this photo taken? Was it in A, Cuba, B, France, C, Albuquerque, or D, Florida? I'll wait. The answer is Florida. If you answered Cuba, that was a completely reasonable answer because you may have recognized that this is the Cuban brown anole, Anola segrii, and it is probably now the commonest lizard in Florida. It is a so-called invasive species that was introduced decades ago and is now found throughout the state. It's ubiquitous. It's spread outside of Florida, and as I said, you see them everywhere. Our lecture today is going to be about these kinds of species. That is, herps that have gone to a new place outside of their range through human actions. And usually we'll be talking about things that have spread and colonized and established there. But you'll see there's kind of a range of things that are called introduced or all the way to invasive. If you answered Cuba, totally reasonable. You probably recognize it was a Cuban lizard. If you answered France, that's also reasonable. This photo was taken at the French Pavilion in Epcot of Disney World. Okay, so this is our outline today. We're going to be talking about invasive non-native species. We'll first establish what are they, and we'll get some terminology down. This field was actually hampered for a long time by not having a standardized terminology, but it's now been established. The first thing we'll do is look at some examples, some really well-known ones, some ones with some really well-known effects. Invasive species and non-native species are usually vilified by biologists, and biologists often try and convince the public, often successfully, that they are bad. We're going to review that point of view, and then we're going to come back and review counterpoints. We'll do some of that along the way with the they are bad section, but then we'll talk about some reasons they may not be so bad. This comparing recent and historical invaders, I will see if we have time for that. I don't want to put too much into this, given our format here. But okay, so there was actually an executive order during the Clinton administration, Executive Order 13112, that states that an invasive species is defined as a species that is non-native to its ecosystem and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause, that likely part's key, economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. What those terms mean is important also. Invasive species may be plants, animals, other organisms like microbes, and we are generally considering human actions either directly or indirectly to be responsible for this kind of translocation. So the terminology here can be put in line with the stages of invasion. So the kind of steps that a species goes through in order to get established and be actually called an invader. The first step is just moving some individuals to a new place. This may be called introduction or just transport. Once something from one range is in a new place, it may be referred to as exotic or alien or non-native. The next step is actually establishing a breeding population. So once you are, so it's one thing to have, you know, a bunch of individuals in an area that you know, are just there because they've escaped or whatever. But it's not really considered an issue until you have these things actually establishing a population. So this step is sometimes called a colonization, although that's sometimes applied to that first step as well. Establishment and naturalization are more common. So the process may be referred to as establishment or naturalization, but the species then, and that where that population in the new place is then considered to be a naturalized species. Now, the final stage being in this topic is invasion or spread. And this is when this population of things that are in a new place actually spreads out and is then found in new areas. You know, maybe it's just expanded from the city park to the rest of the town, or maybe it's, you know, working its way up Florida like Segrii. All right, so we have our terminology. Let's look at some examples. All right, the brown tree snake, Boiga irregularis, on Guam. There's going to be a lot of cases that I talk about today that are sort of overblown, made to be a bigger deal than they are. This isn't one of them. If you want to look for an example where invasive species have caused problems that it clearly caused big problems in things that people care about. So Guam has a big military presence in the United States. It takes in a lot of planes. Sometime before 1950, this brown tree snake, which is a couple meters long, rear fang, mildly venomous, native to Australia and some of the islands north of there, Micronesia. Sometime before 1950, this snake was accidentally transported into Guam. First individuals that I know of that were really tracked, or when noticed that there were a lot there, was 1952. Pretty rapidly after that, the population of snakes just exploded, and to the point that you know, by the 60s and into the 70s, they're this huge pest species. They're causing lots of population declines in native fauna. They're causing electrical outages by getting into wires. You know, they can be kind of a bitey snake if you try and grab them and move them somewhere else. And in the end game, by 1998, 16 of the 22 native bird species were actually extirpated from the island. It doesn't mean those species are all extinct. I could track down one endemic species from Guam that was extinct. The others that were extinct on Guam are living in some capacity somewhere else. But not just that. One of the three mammal species, a bat, went extinct, attributable to this guy, and then something like 3 to 5 or the 10 to 12 reptile species. So they had some small lizards, geckos living there mostly. Brown tree snakes aren't the only exotic species on Guam. There's something like a half dozen frog species. There's at least three lizards, including Anolis carolinensis. There's another snake, a blind snake. But this is one that has been an ongoing issue. Efforts to eradicate it, knock its population back, were commenced in, I think, 1990s. And then from there, they've had a mixed bag. They've tried a lot of different things. One of them I'm going to show you in a movie in a moment. But now, today, which is a long time after that, either the snakes themselves, certainly this is an aspect where the snakes themselves have sort of topped out their resources. But also some of these eradication measures probably had something to do with it. There are some of the bird species that weren't extirpated but actually knocked down have been shown to be coming back now. And another aspect of this that has to be kept in mind is that, okay, these are this invasive species that in some of these cases you can clearly track it to, okay, this was the guy that's at fault. But You also have a huge amount of building and development on this island, so that the forest is not what it used to be in any way, shape, or form. So multiple factors happening. Clearly, the snake had something to do with several of these extinctions. But let me show you an example of kind of what's being done. All right, so this is just a really brief clip that shows you one of the approaches that was implemented. So what this is they are aerial dropping these capsules. There's a white mouse in there, and then within the mouse is aspirin, which apparently is poisonous to these snakes. And so they're dropping all these baits in the trees. These things are, well, they're not just arboreal, but they do get arboreal. And the idea is that they're going to find these prey items and eat them, and that it's going to knock them back. This is just one of many measures that have been implemented. You also have boots on the ground, people looking for these things and taking them out and hunting them. And as I said, they've had limited success, but enough along with the snakes sort of topping out with their biology, their carrying capacity, that they finally seem to be receding now, and in their population, and some of the other animals are coming back. All right, the Burmese python in the Everglades. So this is one that gets a lot of press, probably because it's a big snake. People don't like snakes. Anyway, as background for this, so Florida, we'll talk about Florida a fair amount today, is just a hotbed for naturalized species. There's bunches of things from all over the world that have established breeding populations there. You can go to a city park and catch lizards from Africa and Central America, South America, the Caribbean, within a half-acre plot of land. So this instance of something from somewhere else becoming established isn't a big deal. I think the fact that it's a big snake bothers people, and then also that it's in the Everglades, because a lot of naturalized things just never get out of human created areas and never get into natural areas. Everglades isn't exactly natural these days, but they do their best to have it be that way. Anyway, 1979 was when the first kind of known observation of a Burmese python in Florida, or in the Everglades, occurred. So sometime before 1979, it became established breeding populations. You had a couple decades there where they were clearly in the Everglades. People would find them, but they weren't, a so-called problem or invasive species. Prompted by a number of things. Sometimes invasive species just are kind of confined in an area for years and years, and then they start to spread, and it's not always clear why. In this case, there was one event that really upped the population. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew came through, and southern Florida, right near the Everglades, there's a bunch of animal importers, and they bring a lot of stuff in, and Hurricane Andrew hit one of these, and a bunch of the herps, including chameleons and other things, but Burmese pythons, which were very popular in the pet trade. Apparently dozens of them were released during this hurricane, and that was thought to be something of a trigger. But anyway, as of something like 20 years ago, this has become really a big deal in the popular press. there's been some, academic studies that give a correlative relationship between observations of some of the common mammals like opossums or raccoons, and the observations or the population of this snake, and to the point where, again, getting back to this is a snake that people don't like. They have roundups where people are paid to come in and take and kill as many of these as they can, or extract, and then somebody else kills them or does something with them. But you can get a job being a snake hunter in the Florida Everglades, specializing on Burmese pythons. Now, this snake has not caused the extinction of anything. That much is clear. The populations that there's evidence that it's knocked down are some of the common things I mentioned: possums, raccoons, some of the super common birds. So, this is made a big deal out of, but I don't think anybody's too concerned about opossums going extinct, for example. So this is one that I think, undeniably the ecosystem has been changed, but, it's pretty cool that there's this huge snake cruising around in the Everglades as part of the fauna there, in my view. It's not the received view, but, whether or not, the kinds of damage, so-called damage this thing is causing are not that clear, and then also, why we interpret those as damage is not clear. That's something that we'll talk about quite a bit today. Here's some video of the kind of perception of this.
Probably one of the worst animals to have make it into a natural area in this region. The Burmese python negatively impacted the Everglades.
So these pythons have been released into this habitat, unintentionally, of course, and without knowledge of the consequences, and they proliferate. We've seen entire deer inside a snake. We've seen a struggle between a large alligator and a large snake. All of a sudden, you have this apex predator out in your system threatening your native species. So it's a big problem.
And they're incredibly difficult to detect. I mean, they can hide in not very much cover at all. That's 100,000 animals spread over 3 million acres, plus some other undeveloped land, agricultural land. Are there 100,000? Probably not. There's probably less than that. But we just don't know.
We just don't know.
Yeah, no, the alligators, the deer, they're not gonna go extinct because of this guy. But anyway, next one. All right, the cane toad in Australia, Rhinella marina or Bufo marina. These giant toads, as you can see from the picture there, are native to Central America. They're big things that eat anything that can fit in their mouth. Not native to Australia. In 1935, the sugar industry was huge in northern and eastern Australia. Lots of sugar cane grown. There was a native beetle, a cane beetle, that was having a negative effect on the sugar cane in the country, and they got the idea to bring in these toads to help combat the sugarcane beetle. Supposedly there was an official who was at a meeting in the Caribbean and had heard that these things were actually effective and that there weren't any negative environmental impacts, so that it would work. And so in 1935, they released 2,400 individuals. Some people kind of freaked out and said, let's not do this. There was a ban for a while, but then by 1936, they came around to releasing a lot more. And then not too long after that, the population started to really pick up. You can see sort of a spread map there where, again, things, they're clearly expanding, but, it's up in the 70s when things really take off. They had periods where they were expanding at something like 50 kilometers per year, the population. A lot of neat research has been done on these guys. Evolutionary adaptations in the frogs, also in their prey and their interactions with predators. They're very toxic toxins in their skin that can, negatively affect pets. They can be super, super common where they're just, you can walk and kick into one. So seen as quite a pest species. Now, much like the python, they haven't caused the extinction of anything. Much also like the python, they're kind of at a place where they've probably invaded as much as they're going to invade. And they're probably on the downside in terms of what their populations are doing. Have they had an impact on some things? It appears so. Certainly things have changed, but again, the dire everything's going to hell has not happened. This is a sort of well-known campy movie that came out in 1988 that here's a preview for it that will give you some idea of
One male and one female endowment is more than sufficient to populate the entire top end of the Northern Territory.
The best thing is to get rid of him, get a big stick and hit him with it.
Practice of going out and getting one of these things and putting it in, really boiling it down and eating the residue, I think is absolutely repulsive.
When I'm driving the car, I have no hesitation running over them whatsoever.
I couldn't do without them. They're friends. They're friends.
Right, and it's supposed to be kind of a chilling end there to what is going on, but yeah, it's at that stage now where there's nothing to be done about them. They're going to be there. They're part of the fauna now, and so it's more dealing with them in a way that you can deal with them, which I think probably involves as much kind of social adaptation as it does any kind of extermination action at this point. The coqui frogs these are native to Puerto Rico, and this is one that's also in Florida, but this is actually the story of them in California. They popped up in California not that long ago. I think something like 15 or 20 years ago, maybe a little less than that actually. Became established in neighborhoods, so they're not out in whatever parts of California aren't completely developed. They're in these neighborhoods, and they call. They have a call that is apparently the name supposedly comes from the call, coqui, 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 and they're getting a lot of bad press there. So the tropical frog's shrill mating song keeps Southern California residents up at night. And so we'll hear some commentary here from a local biologist, Greg Pauley, who's a herpetologist at the LA County Museum there.
Tonight we are at a nursery in Torrance, California, which has the unfortunate situation of being infested with coqui frogs. The coqui frog is considered a restricted species in the state of California, and the reason for that is because it's incredibly loud and it has the potential to keep people awake at night. A lot of people mistake it for a broken alarm, for example. And so it has some human health impacts in the sense that it can really impact people's lives if it shows up in their neighborhood.
So notice first the language. It's unfortunate that they're here and it's an infestation. And second, notice what's the big problem here, right? It's not causing the extinction of anything. It's not causing disease. It's not hurting pets. The problem is it's keeping some people awake, I guess. So very negative view of these guys in California. Let's take a look at the view of them in Puerto Rico, where they're native.
El Cocky, mi mamá, escalando el cantar las noches al ir a acostarme, me adormece cantando así. Coqui, 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 coqui.
So, I'm not a native Spanish speaker, but that sounded pretty positive. So here you have this juxtaposition where there's this horrible thing that keeps people up at night in California, but in Puerto Rico, the sound is pleasant and welcoming and something that we're happy about. All right, so those are our examples. Let's move on to some of the general issues and look at the perception that non-native species are bad. Notice that I did a switcheroo there from saying invasive to now non-native. And the reason is that even though when pressed, a lot of biologists will say, okay, invasive species are the problem, just them being established is not, they'll really come around to the idea that, okay, all non-native species are held with suspicion and therefore any kind of non-native establishment is bad because they could become invasive in the future. Anyway. All right, first issue, they are said to cost billions of dollars per year. It's been hard to track down where those billions come from, whether it's actually billions. It also doesn't account for the positive economic aspects of non-native species. You got to do both sides of the ledger here. You can't just count up what's negative. There's a lot of native species that cost billions as well for control and for other things. And then an important aspect is that a lot of this is eradication costs, which is the cost to remove those species. If you didn't try to remove them, then they wouldn't cost so much. We're giving ourselves that cost when we say that they're costing billions. This is a statement that the only cost that's associated with this horrible plant, supposedly in Canada, is that you're trying to get rid of them, and so if you just left them, you wouldn't have those costs. This is a bit more academic treatment of it, and saying the cost of invasive herps was something about like 17 billion over that period from 1986 to 2020. Which seems like a lot. However, when they were kind of counting it up, it's really for just two species. Boiga regularis, which, is the cost is on that island, and then the bullfrog. And after that, the rest of it really isn't so much. So that's a big number, but, let's say we take the hit on these two and deal with it because they're here, then we'd be fine, right, economically? And this, this making the point that costs are positively correlated with research effort. You're trying to figure these things out, and you're putting money into eradicating them. If you just let them be, you wouldn't have these costs. All right, there's the thought that invasive species and non-native species, they somehow damage ecosystems. Here's a statement on that from the Nature Conservancy. When a species is introduced in a new landscape, the consequences can be devastating. They can push out native species and cause ecological chaos. Well, that sounds bad. The indirect effects involve changing food webs. They can destroy or replace native food sources. Invasive species can affect the abundance of species of native wildlife, and then they can alter ecosystems in different ways. Okay, so let's look at these things that have been called damage or harm. But think about, how can an ecosystem really be harmed or damaged? Certainly it can be changed. But once you say it's harmed, you're saying that, you know, the state on the other side is worse than the state before that. And that is really an ethical judgment that is strange, I think, when you're talking about, you know, whether a species is there or not. It really, a lot of it comes down to us thinking about native species and non-native species according to different levels of value. And why is it that the native species are the ones that have the value here? And why would an ecosystem that just has native species in it be somehow ethically superior to an ecosystem that includes non-native species? And then, you know, the terminology here is peppered with, you know, a lot of pejorative words. But, you know, think about those words. It's not just, well, harm or damage to an ecosystem. What is ecological chaos? Like, what does that mean? You know, things are different ecologically, but chaos? And how is chaos bad for an ecosystem? You know, maybe chaos is good for an ecosystem. All right, so undeniably, non-native species, they change ecosystems. And at the bottom quote there, you know, the combination of quotes actually, I'm focusing on, you know, the terminology about, you know, change and altering and all that. But the important point to remember is change is not the same as damaging, and it doesn't mean harming, it doesn't mean injuring. Change isn't bad. There's no ecological dysfunction is another term I've seen, or corruption. There's nothing immoral or unethical on its face about changing an ecosystem. Okay, there's a background there that we're bringing to it, that we're seeing this thing as bad, and we're calling it bad, but it's not just bad on itself. That's not a scientific aspect. It's the ethics of our point of view that call that bad. All right, let's look at some complicating factors here. One is that with a lot of invasive species, when you're demonstrating some so-called impact, that impact you're demonstrating is significantly different in a statistical sense, but really not that different. So, you know, I'm familiar with the anolis lizards. In Florida, I mentioned Anolis segrii invading, and there's a native species there called Anolis carolinensis, the green anole. That graph in the lower left here shows that green anoles perch slightly higher when brown anoles invaded, right? But just slightly. Look at those box plots. They're right next to each other. More importantly is this view that this is a negative effect. Like, why is it bad that a species is perching slightly higher? Right? I mean, it's not a bad thing unless we're bringing a lot of baggage to it in terms of, you know, preferring this native lizard, this native species, or this, you know, native ecosystem over one that has an extra species in it. And you can take that view, but notice that, you know, there's a lot that has to go into that. It just does, it's not an axiom. It's not an ethical axiom. You have to, you know, it's a view that needs to be supportive. Another complicating factor is that, okay, non-native species are bad, but in some cases they need protection in some areas, but not in others. So this is going to show you a turtle example where in some cases this turtle is a pest species. In another, it's a farm species that, you know, we eat. And in another, it's
brackish waters of Asia, as we have the Chinese soft-shelled turtle. This species of soft-shelled turtle was originally endemic to China, where they usually inhabit rivers and brackish coastal areas. Unlike some other turtles, the Chinese soft-shelled turtles prefer to spend most of their time in water, and have a few interesting adaptations to help them do this, as this species is able to absorb oxygen through their skin and the lining of their throat. And with the help of this adaptation, they thrive in aquatic environments, feeding on fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and insects. On this diet, they can reach a maximum size of around 33 centimeters or 13 inches across the carapace. But in their native range, they are classed as vulnerable to extinction. And as China doesn't have the best conservation record, it's quite easy to guess how they became vulnerable. The Chinese soft-shell turtle is the most commonly raised species in China's turtle farms. And from data obtained from 684 Chinese turtle farms, they had sold 91 million turtles of this species every year. And considering that these farms represented less than half of the turtle farms in China, this number is thought to be a lot larger across the country. The main reason for this farming is that this species is used in turtle soup. But it isn't just China that farms these turtles, as they're also farmed in many countries around Asia. And because of how popular the turtle soup industry is, they are the world's most economically important turtle. And because some of these turtles escape from farms and also released as pets, there are now established populations in many other Asian countries as well as Spain, Brazil and Hawaii. This turtle can cause damage as an invasive species, mainly by eating the native fish and crustaceans.
So, depending on where this species is and what role it's fulfilling, whether as a farmed food item or an escaped pest or as a native valued species, it has different views, different treatments in terms of its value depending on which of these roles it's fulfilling where. Okay, this is a good complicating factor for the view that invasive species are bad. We mentioned Florida as being this kind of amusement park of invasive species. Kenneth Crisco, who's done a lot of study of invaders, calls Florida the cesspool of the world when it comes to introduced species. But in my biology classes, I've always learned that biodiversity is a good thing. Wildlife supports healthy ecosystems. It helps humans stay healthy then. It's an essential part of climate change. It's good for the economy. It's important culturally. So these are all things praising biodiversity on conservation.org. The simplest measure of biodiversity is just counting up species. And there are lots of different ways to measure biodiversity, but that's the simplest. So in Florida, all these invaders from all over the world have hugely jumped the biodiversity of the state. So we're in a great place, right? We're enhancing biodiversity. We're much better than we were before. That's not the view, right? It's a cesspool. So it's not biodiversity we're valuing here. It's a very particular kind of biodiversity. All right, next section, we will start to talk about positive views of non-native species. Now's a good time, I think, for us to take a break.